and welcome to Trusty Chords, the podcast which aims to celebrate music and those that create it. The world of alternative rock would likely not be anywhere close to what it is today without bands like the Jesus and Mary Chain. Forming in Glasgow back in 1983 by brothers Jim and William Reid, the Scottish outfit are these days considered to be pioneers of genres like alternative rock, shoegaze and noise pop. Combining these genres with their own unique take on post-punk and indie rock, and you've got a recipe for something that feels impossible to describe. Having emerged from a world in which punk rock and pop music had reigned supreme, the Jesus and Mary Chain found themselves wanting to make music which sounded different, and thus employed copious amounts of noise and feedback. The result was something jarring, and a sound that made it difficult for the band to get their foot in the door. Eventually, they began making a name for themselves, with the likes of The NME calling them the best band in the world for their intense live performances, and others labelling them the new Sex Pistols, due to those aforementioned intense live shows. Despite gigs earmarked by drink, drugs and debauchery, the Jesus and Mary Chain also made some truly amazing music. It's impossible to look past records like Psycho Candy, Darklands and Automatic without noticing the brilliance that lies under that noisy, shimmering surface. Likewise, songs like Head On, April Skies and Just Like Honey, which you might recognise from the closing scene of Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation, deserve to be listed among some of the best of all time. In 1998, the Jesus and Mary Chain's existence came to a premature halt due to disagreements between Jim and William that resulted in the latter walking off stage and quitting the tour. In 1999, they formally split and wouldn't perform again until 2007. Since then, they've continued to tour and record new music, with Damage and Joy, their first album in 19 years, arriving in 2017, and Glasgow Eyes being released back in March. Now they're returning to Australia for the first time in 5 years this August, the aptly titled 40 Years Tour. This week, I was lucky enough to be joined by Jim Reid for a wonderful chat about the band's storied history and their current activities. Check out the Jesus and Mary Chain's latest album, Glasgow Eyes, and once you're done giving that a spin, grab a ticket to their upcoming tour, have a listen to our chat, and I'll see you at the end of the episode for some general housekeeping. Jim Reid, thank you very much for joining this episode of the Trusty Chords podcast.
Hi, thanks. Nice to be here.
Now, you're someone who is quite well regarded in the world of music, but I guess for those who might not recognize your name, are you able to give me a quick few words on who you are and why we're chatting today?
Well, I'm Jim Reid. I'm in a band called the Jesus and Mary Chain, and I guess we are chatting because I suppose some people are into the records that we've made.
They certainly are. I mean, that's definitely the reason why I jumped at the chance to have a chat with you today. And I guess that sort of leads into what we usually start with in this podcast, which is we talk about a love of music. So I like to sort of go back to the early days at the start, and I'd sort of love to ask you if you have any particular early memories of when music first really resonated with you.
When we were pretty young, me and William, my brother William, we got a record player. William got a record player for his birthday, and we had no records to play on it. So we borrowed a bunch of records from my cousin. And those records were mostly Beatles records. And that was kind of the beginning of our journey, I suppose. Those records stayed with us. They were, at the time, it was a big deal. You know, we'd never gotten into music to that degree before, but those Beatles records are still in our record collection to this day. So that was the beginning of the start of the musical journey.
So then, how did you both actually start playing music? It's like I'm assuming that some of this influence of bands like the Beatles might have played into that as things went along.
Well, I mean, yeah, but I mean, this playing it is different from being someone that listens to it hugely. I mean, we were kind of interested in music for a long time before we even considered being in a band. Beatles first, then it was glam rock in the 70s. We were into, Bowie and T-Rex and even stuff like Mud and Alvin Stardust. It all made sense to us at that time. But at that time, the idea of making bands, guys in bands were like they were from another planet as far as we were concerned, and we never really thought we could be like those guys until punk rock happened. And punk seemed to suggest that anyone could do it, which of course they could, but not necessarily successfully. I mean, what it kind of gave you the keys to the door, punk rock, really, and it was up to you what you made of it. I mean, it made you understand that you didn't have to learn how to play an instrument for 5 years before you could make music, and it didn't matter what you looked like. Punk rock was just a great leveler, and at that time we then entertained the idea of making music, starting a band, but being lazy, which we are. We didn't get around to doing it for years and years and years. But that was the beginning. That was the seed was sown with punk music. We had the Ramones. That was it. It's like God, so basic. But yeah, it sounds like easy to do, but it just sounds it's actually not that easy to do.
Well, I mean, these days there are obviously so many more opportunities and avenues, but especially back around the era of punk music really sort of becoming a thing, the avenues just they were non-existent unless you were sort of lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. But I guess
Well,
when
no, the great thing about punk music is it wasn't just the music that changed. The people that kind of made the music happen. Like there would be people that would start DIY that became independent, i.e., indie record labels. So rather than have to go cap in hand to big Mr. Warner Brothers, like Bugs Bunny or whatever, you've got these enthusiasts that you can make records on a smaller scale, but that could lead to bigger things. So punk opened all of the doors, really.
so once those doors were opened, was there any particular sound that you guys were actually aiming to achieve? Because punk rock, it's much more of a gritty sound, but having sounds like the Beatles as formative sounds, were you trying to make punk music or were you trying to make pop music?
Well, I mean, we thought that punk could be both punk and pop. I mean, I think the Buzzcocks proved that, and so did the Ramones. What I suppose one of the reasons why it took us so long to get it together is that at the beginning we didn't know what we wanted to sound like. We knew what we didn't want to sound like, and as much as we loved punk, punk sort of kind of uh, was a spent force within a year. So we knew that it wasn't good enough just to go out there and just like sound like a 1977 punk band. You had to bring something else to the table, and all of the post punk bands like. The Bunnymen and the Cocktail Twins all seem to find their sound, and it took us a while to find our feet, and we weren't really sure how the band ought to sound, and I suppose it was we were into things like pop music. I mean, just out and out pop music, mostly from the 1960s and 70s. But we were also into like noise music and experimental music like Cabaret Voltaire and Einstürzen and Neubauten. And we wondered why nobody combined the two sounds. And so we thought that that would be what we would do. We would make sort of something that had some of the elements of mainstream pop music, but done in an avant-garde kind of a way.
So I think that's one thing that's always really appealed me to the Mary Chain is that there is this sense of the crunchy and the smooth, so to speak. It's got that sort of,
Mm.
saccharine sweetness of pop music, but at the same time, there's this really sort of like menacing undertone, which I feel
Mm.
comes from both worlds. But I mean, if you were to look at reviews of the band, people always call you guys pioneers of like shoegaze and alternative rock. Is that something that you agree with? I mean, when you sort of look back at those days, did you see what you were doing as groundbreaking, or was it just sort of business as usual as you tried to work out what you were trying to do?
Well, we didn't analyze it too much. We didn't. I mean, we didn't sort of wake up in the morning and say, "Let's make it some groundbreaking music today."
Yeah.
But we did have an eye on the future. We would have been hugely disappointed had our records not lasted more than the time that they were made in. We made Psycho Candy. We had the idea that for it to be really successful, people would have to be listening to that record in 10, 20, 30, 40 years' time. And so they are, it's like we are here. I mean, we were listening to a lot of music from the 50s and 60s when we started, And those bands, we wanted to be like them. We wanted to have that kind of longevity. We wanted to make music that wasn't just entertainment for the year that it was made in. We wanted to make music that, first of all, was art, and secondly, would be art that would make sense in any decade. So, I mean, we didn't set out to rewrite the rules, but at the same time, we wanted it to continue for a long time. I mean, I believe that our music will be listened to long after me and William are dead. So that's it. We may die, but hopefully the music doesn't have to.
I mean, was that something that you were actually thinking of, I guess, back in, the early days of the band? Like the music you're making at the time, were you thinking this has, the sort of longevity to last about 40 odd years?
We were, and we used to
Yeah.
say that to people in interviews because people would say things like, "Oh, right, what are you going to be doing in 5 years' time?" As if that there was a kind of a disposable sell-by date on the band. And we used to say, well, not only are we going to be here in 5 years' time doing what we're doing now, but the music is also going to be around in 25, 30, 40 years' time. People would laugh at you when you said things like that back then. But I'm sitting here 40 years later talking to you, so
Yeah.
I'd say that we have been proven right.
Well, because that was something I was even thinking then when you said you were saying it back in the day. I mean, like surely people would have just thought you were either arrogant or something like that in thinking that you'd have this longevity. But at the same time, you guys had the talent, you had the songs to back it up. I can completely see why you would back yourselves in,
But
in that sense.
I can see why you might say it's arrogant, but the reason I say not so is like it's simple that we were listening to bands that didn't exist any longer. Like
Yeah.
just off the top of my head, say somebody like the 13th Floor Elevators. Now they might not have like set the world alight, but enough so that they made people like us in East Kilbride 20, 30 years later want to make music. And that's all I'm saying. We wanted to be like that.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that we were going to be the Rolling Stones or the Beatles, but it was just good enough to us to think that there would be some little misfit malcontents sitting somewhere, anywhere on the planet, listening to Psycho Candy in, like, say, 2015 or something like that, thinking, I want to do that. I want to do that, but I want to update it. That was the whole idea with our music. We wanted to leave little messages for people not yet born.
Well, I mean, it's funny you say that because I mean, when albums like Psycho Candy came out, I wasn't yet born. But when I discovered it as like a young teenager, I sort of felt like that young misfit malcontent on the other side of the world. In that, like Jesus and Mary Chain felt like a band that no one else knew. Even though when you realize how many people had the album, well, I was just clearly wrong. I was talking to the wrong people. But it does go to show that music does have that impact, even if at the time.
In terms of like how many people it affected, almost like we didn't even care that much. Just the idea that even if a handful of people somewhere down the line started making music in 30 years from that point, that excited us. It's just the thought that that could be the case was kind of what it was all about for us, really.
Yeah, well, I can definitely say mission accomplished because it was albums like Psycho Candy that actually made me pick up a guitar back in the day. So thank you, I guess. And I guess looking at those sort of, that early sort of period of the band as well. I mean, I'm sure we could talk for hours about those early days, but if you look back at those early years, people always sort of like focus on things like the drink, the drugs, and the debauchery and everything like that. And that seems to sort of overshadow a lot of the band. And talking to you now, however, it sort of feels like this impossibility. You could be anything but humble fellow. But I'm assuming that you'll probably say that you and William are quite reserved so these days. But how do you sort of view the reputation that the band has? Like, how do you view the band of the '80s compared to the Mary Chain today?
Well, I think you're right. A lot of that stuff got in the way at the beginning, and a lot of that came from our insecurity. I mean, we drank too much and we did take drugs, but it was mostly because we were terrified of being on stage. I mean, it certainly was with me. I was the singer, and I was not comfortable with that. Uh, in my head, in my fantasies, I was. But when it came to the reality, I mean, when we were planning the band, I mean, we were both shy, me and William, so we actually, neither of us wanted to be the singer. But when it ended up being me, and I realized that I actually had to go out there and stand in front of an audience and be this guy, I had imagined how that I should present myself. And I realized immediately that I didn't have it. I wasn't that confident. I was shy. And the only way I could do it was to get drunk or like to take drugs. But the thing about that is, you're right, it becomes what people then talk about. And it did frustrate us a bit that, people would talk about the wrong things. They would talk about riot shows that weren't our fault, or certainly wasn't our intention. May have been our fault, but not what we intended to do. And so we just wanted people to talk about the records, talk about the music. But we could see why people were talking about those chaotic shows and our behavior on stage because of intoxication. But it was based around insecurity. We just felt as if the only way we could get through those times was to get wasted. And it took us many years to realize that there were other ways to present yourself. And that actually it was all about, we should have realized it was all about the music. I didn't need to go out there and be Mick Jagger, I can't be. I can't, like Iggy Pop, whatever, like Mr. Superpunk. That was just not me. I couldn't do it. I tried long enough and I kind of got close when I was wasted, but it took me years to realize that just going out there and singing those songs, the band performing those songs, is all really people wanted. And once I kind of realized that, I felt a whole lot more comfortable being on stage. I'm not a showman. The people come to see the Mary Chain now, I'm awkward as hell. And I find it very awkward to talk to the audience. Sometimes William tunes up to me, for about 30 seconds, but to me feels like half an hour. And I've got to I'm sort of standing there like, oh Christ, I better say something to the audience. And I'll walk up and I'll mumble some idiotic nonsense and regret it immediately. But it doesn't matter. I mean, people come and they keep coming, and so we're doing something right, and that gives you some confidence.
I mean, I'm sure that by now you'll always be your own worst critic in those moments, and those moments of silence will be magnified tenfold. And no one will remember them. But I guess speaking of the band these days, this year also sees a new album from the Mary Chain, with a new album arriving back in March. So it is wonderful to hear new music, but I would love to know what does an album like this say about who the Mary Chain are in 2024?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. That's for other people to say. I mean, to me, what it says, as far as I'm concerned, is we're still here and we still care, and we're still making music for the same reasons we started making music. If it sounded like something that was trying to get on the radio, or if it sounded like we were trying to appeal to like 20-year-olds, whatever, it just sounds to me like we've made a record for us, and that's the way it always was. That's the way it always should be. And I think that a lot of bands lose sight of that. And a lot of bands start making music for record companies, or they start making music for Spotify, or they start making music for their audience. And you should never do any of those things. You should make music for yourself. And if it works, that's great. And if it doesn't, you can at least hold your head up and say, but I like it.
Yeah.
That's a great record. I'm sorry you don't think so. I mean, we've done that. We made records that nobody was interested in. Monkey, we made our record that nobody seemed to care about. And at the end of it, yeah, I love that record. And I can't help that nobody else does. And that would have been the same with this record. If nobody would have been interested at all, then life would have gone on, and we could have at least held our head up saying, well, sorry you didn't like it, but we do.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, there will be, there will be at least one positive review, and even if it is coming from inside the band, then so be it. So, and with the release of this album, we do also see you guys returning to Australia for the first time in, I think, 5 years it is. So you've been visiting Australia since the late 80s, and the crowds just seem to constantly love the Mary Chain. And I'm obviously under no illusion of how costly the undertaking is. So what is it about Australia that keeps bringing you guys back? Is it the crowds, I guess?
Well, I mean, that's it. I mean, it's just nice to be appreciated. Do you know what I'm saying? And it's like you go. Yeah, when we come to Australia, there's always an appreciative audience, and that is something we will we treasure and we will travel for.
Well, I think we should get down to the portion of the podcast from which its namesake is derived. So, trusty chords is built around the average chord. So, folks who know theory know that your standard chord has the first, third, and fifth notes of a scale. So, I sort of extrapolate this a bit and I ask about one artist, three albums, and five songs that have influenced you. So, I guess the first question for you, Jim, who is one artist that has inspired you the most, whether it be personally or creatively?
Oh, that's difficult. I mean, there's so many, to be honest. And I feel like I have to talk for William as well because I would say personally, the Iggy and the Stooges is a band that I always go back to. And Iggy, those Berlin albums that he made with Bowie were just two of the best records I've ever heard.
Mm.
The Idiot, Lust for Life. Um, and I think William would probably say the Beatles. William absolutely adores the Beatles, as do I, but I would probably go with Iggy Pop.
And then next up, what are three albums that have impacted you the most? This could be albums that you're always listening to or something that has been integral to your musical evolution.
Um, well, I think the Velvet Underground and Nico was probably one of the best records that anyone has ever made. To me, the Velvets were like the Beatles, but on the flip side of the coin, if you know what I mean. They were as good as, but never got the recognition till later that they deserved. I mean, to me, it's just bizarre that, that's the original Psycho Candy. Because when you think about it, you've got this band with an album that's got a song called Heroin on it. Now, I'm not going to glamorize drugs or whatever, but it's a bizarre subject matter for somebody that was singing it in 1966, 67. But on the same album, you've got I'll Be Your Mirror. It's a beautiful record with no flaws. And so I would say that I am going to choose Iggy again. I think Lust for Life. Oh, that's so difficult to choose between Lust for Life or The Idiot, but I'll go for Lust for Life. Again, it's just music that just seems to be. It could exist in almost any decade, timeless. Um, another record, Unknown Pleasures by Joy Division. Because in after punk, when everybody was confused and nobody knew what to do, and there was this period where it was like people were just like confused by what direction to go in next, and then there was Joy Division, and it suddenly everything sort of seemed to click and fall into place. That record's amazing.
It is also actually sort of quite interesting that you do mention the Velvet Underground before, because as a slightly funny story, I remember buying a copy of that album on the very same day I bought a copy of Stoned and Dethroned. So it was a nice little full circle moment there, I guess. And I guess lastly, I'd also love to know the five songs that you can always turn to. So whether it be for comfort or excitement, the five trusty songs you can always turn to.
I mean, this is going to be off the top of my head. Something like Nothing to Be Done by the Pastels, a band from Glasgow. Um, Something like Cherie by Suicide always gets me there. Always one of those songs that I never tire of. Um, Something like Autobahn by Kraftwerk. Depending on what mood I'm in, I'll maybe go for the whole full length 20-minute version.
If you've got the time of
Um,
day.
and then maybe Mushroom by Can. We used to do a really bad cover version of that, but the original is absolutely fantastic. Is that four?
That's four songs,
So
yeah.
let me think. I see. Everything's in the past, but it has to be because I'm wildly out of touch with music now. So let me try and think of something more up to date. Not more up to date, but still not up to date. I would probably go for something uh, by the Kills, maybe Black Rooster by the Kills,
Hmm. Those are some
which is
really, to say there's some
the
really
the,
good and diverse choices there.
the Kills. I think are like the last great rock and roll band. I think it's. I mean they've got that kind of like quality that thread that runs through from Chuck Berry to Rolling Stones to Iggy and the Stooges to New York Dolls to the Mary Chain to Joy Division to the Kills. I think they are one of those bands.
Actually, I think over the last 5 years, I've managed to interview both Alison and Jamie from the Kills, and I remember that Alison was such a wonderful and upbeat sort of person, whereas Jamie was such a hard, he was a very tough nut to crack. And to me, that's an example of why they work so well together. It's just she's his powder keg.
I've never met them at all, but I really like their music.
Yeah, I can. I mean, if you do ever meet them, I can assume that Jamie probably won't be saying too much, but as is his wont to do. Well, Jim Reid, I do want to say thank you so very much for being generous with your time today and for being part of the Trusty Chords podcast.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. Nice to meet you.
Thank you for listening to Trusty Chords. If you've listened to this episode and didn't immediately switch over to an episode of Casefile, then I'd really appreciate it if you could take some time to follow, share, and review this podcast on your preferred platform of choice. Feel free to listen to an episode of Casefile after you've done so, however. There's been some great episodes lately. If you're eager to follow along on social media, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Trusty Chords Podcast, all one word. I'm also on Twitter at Trusty Chords Pod due to the way they deal with usernames. There's also a blog for this podcast on my own website, which is tylerjenke.com. That's TYLERJENKE/Trusty Chords Podcast, all one word. That's where you can find and read through entries on each episode each week and a list of all the artists, albums, and 5 songs chosen by those artists each week, and the accompanying playlist too. Put simply, if you like podcast content, then my site is the one for you. You can also find a link to the Buy Me a Coffee platform where you can throw me a few dollars to keep this podcast running if you feel so inclined. If you want to actually buy me a coffee, I won't complain either. It's been a bit frosty in Melbourne lately. As usual, thanks to everyone who continues to listen, message, or just support this podcast in any way. I'm forever grateful to hear from you all each week. Lastly, I need to thank Jim Reid for spending time with me this week for the podcast, and I also need to express my gratitude to Chris Marek from Marek Media for helping organise this chat as well. But once again, thank you kindly for listening, and I hope to see you all again next week as I continue to celebrate music and those that create it.